Hello and a very good evening. According to media reports in Manila, Philippine Secretary for Justice Leila de Lima will come to Hong Kong tomorrow to meet with survivors and families of the victims of the 2010 Manila bus hostage tragedy. But those affected by the incident say they haven't heard anything about a meeting with the Philippine officials so far. Evelyn Leung tells us more.
The Philippine news organization ABS-CBN's website reported today that Secretary for Justice Leila de Lima is set to travel to Hong Kong on Monday. She will be giving survivors and family members of fatal victims of the 2010 Manila hostage-taking incident an update on the Philippine government's investigation into the case. The report says it is unclear whether de Lima will be carrying a letter of apology from President Benigno Aquino. However, there are also reports in the Philippines that the Justice Secretary has no plans to come to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, Che Chi-kin, the elder brother of the slain tour guide Ma Sa-tse, said they haven't heard anything about a meeting with de Lima so far. He expressed disappointment over the lack of development in the case. We met with the Secretary for Justice 2 years ago, and nothing came out of the meeting. If we get to meet with her again this time, we want her to respond to our demands, he said. On lawmaker Regina Ip's suggestion that the Hong Kong government should set up a fund to compensate those affected by the tragedy, Tse said this is not what they want. Why should the Hong Kong government offer us a compensation when it's the Philippine government's responsibility? We want justice, he said. Ip also said today that imposing a ban on Filipino domestic helpers won't help the situation, noting that Filipino helpers account for half the foreign domestic helpers here in Hong Kong. We need to think about exactly who will suffer from the ban, she said. It will most likely be local families, Ip added. Some politicians called on the public to boycott Philippine products and to write letters to the Philippine Consulate General here in Hong Kong to express their discontent towards President Benigno Aquino. Evelyn Leung, TVB News.
Secretary for Transport and Housing Anthony Cheung reiterated today that the government wants to keep property cooling measures in place. He said the property market is still volatile and softening the demand-curbing stamp duties may send the wrong signal to investors. Joel De Silva reports.
A new selling point pitched by local property developers is said to be attracting many home buyers. New customers are reimbursed for a substantial part of the amount paid in buyer's stamp duty and double stamp duty. The government says it will not comment on particular sales strategies, but insists that the demand-curbing measures remain necessary. Secretary for Transport and Housing Anthony Cheung said the market is still volatile and that's why the government wants to keep the property cooling measures in place. He explained that any changes to the measures could mislead investors into thinking that the risk in the local property market is gone. And he added that a so-called sunset clause setting an expiry date for the measures is not on the table for consideration. The measures introduced over the past year will be up for scrutiny at the Legislative Council's Bills Committee on Tuesday. Meanwhile, Secretary for Development Paul Chan said in a blog post that in the first quarter of next year, the government will launch a 15-month feasibility study on developing the New Territories North area. The study will include the Fanling Golf Course and Fanling Lodge, the traditional summer retreat of Hong Kong's top leader. Joel De Silva, TVB News.
Turning overseas now, the number of casualties from the most powerful storm to hit India in more than a decade has been relatively light, with only 7 deaths reported so far. Still, the cyclone packed a powerful punch, destroying thousands of homes and causing widespread damage to infrastructure. And weather experts warn heavy rains and strong winds will continue to affect the region over the next few days.
India is picking up the pieces after the most powerful cyclone in more than a decade slammed into the country's eastern seaboard. Cyclone Pailan roared ashore overnight, making landfall in Odisha state, flooding towns and villages and destroying tens of thousands of thatch homes. Still, the country seems to have been spared the widespread loss of life that many had feared would happen when the storm hit. Officials say the priority now is rebuilding local infrastructure and getting aid to the people caught up in the storm. The final number of casualties is expected to climb, and parts of the cyclone-battered coast remain isolated by downed communication links and blocked roads. But initial indications are that the decision by local authorities to evacuate more than 600,000 people from their homes saved many lives. Around 100,000 were also told to leave their homes in neighbouring Andhra Pradesh, which also felt the storm's impact. The cyclone slowed significantly overnight, with some areas reporting little more than breezy drizzles by midday today. But weather experts have warned that parts of the region will face heavy rain and winds for the next 24 hours or so.
U.S. fugitive and whistleblower Edward Snowden may be a criminal to authorities in America, but to some former U.S. government officials, he is a hero. They presented Snowden with the Sam Adams Award for Integrity in Intelligence. In his acceptance speech, Snowden criticized National Security Agency surveillance methods as dangerous to democracy.
This is about a trend in the relationship between the governing and the governed in America that is coming increasingly into conflict with what we expect as a free and democratic people. If we can't understand the policies and programs of our government, we cannot grant our consent in regulating them.
The video released by WikiLeaks was reportedly shot this past week in Moscow, where Snowden was granted asylum back in August. The Americans who awarded Snowden once worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Justice Department, and the NSA. Snowden is still considered a U.S. fugitive charged with espionage.
Tens of thousands of people line the streets of Hanoi today to bid farewell to Vo Nguyen Giap, the general who led Vietnam to victory over France and then the United States. Some cried, others cheered in salute as his flag-draped coffin passed by on a truck-drawn carriage. The procession travelled along a 40-kilometre route from the National Funeral House in central Hanoi to the airport. He was buried later today in his home province in central Vietnam. Nicknamed the Red Napoleon, Giap is considered one of the greatest generals in the 20th century for his victories over vastly better equipped armies which ended French colonial rule and ensured communist control of Vietnam. Well, Australia's Labour Party has elected Bill Shorten as its new leader following the party's drubbing in last month's election. He'll be Labour's third leader in 4 months and takes over as new Conservative Prime Minister Tony Abbott prepares for the first sitting of Parliament. Shorten admitted his job won't be easy.
Rebuilding the Labor Party is a hard task. I don't have to say I'm humbled. I am genuinely humbled at the significant honour and privilege that the people in the Labor Party have displayed by choosing me to be their leader.
Authorities in the eastern city of Ningbo on the mainland are cleaning up an oil spill after a tanker explosion yesterday. The blast left 7 people dead and another person injured. The 300-ton tanker was under repair at a shipyard when the explosion occurred shortly before 9 a.m. The vessel then caught fire and oil leaked into the Yangjiang River, a major source of water for Ningbo, which has a population of more than 7 million. The fire was extinguished in about 2 hours. Maritime authorities sent 6 boats to the scene to deal with the oil leak. Workers set up booms to contain the oil spill as cleanup efforts got underway. The cause of the explosion is still being investigated.
Now back tonight with more local news. The Liquor Licensing Board is imposing additional terms and conditions for liquor license renewals and applications for so-called upstairs bars starting in December. But the Bar and Club Association is worried that some 20% of the city's upstairs bars may have to go out of business because of the new requirements. Andrew Lau has the story.
The new terms and conditions include reducing the maximum number of people allowed at such establishments by 10% and limiting the number of upstairs bars within a building to no more than half of the total number of floors in the building. This time it's 10%. Next time they may reduce the number of people by 20%, says Chris Yu, a representative from a chain of bars. There's a 6-month grace period for the Liquor Licensing Board's new requirements, but the Bar and Club Association thinks that's not enough and might make a significant number of bars to go out of business. Vice Chairman of the association, Chin Chun Wing, says currently there are 450 upstairs bars in Hong Kong. He is worried that as a result of the new terms and conditions, about 20% of the bars will have no choice but to close down. He's even more worried that bar owners may begin operating illegally without a license. The association has called on the government to review its policies as soon as possible and is seeking a dialogue with the authorities. Andrew Lau, TVB News.
The proposed Harbourfront Authority is to develop Hong Kong's harbourfront into a vibrant area for public use. A member of the advisory body, Harbourfront Commission, says there should not be too much commercialisation in the development of the harbourfront. Diane To reports.
Victoria Harbour is one of the most iconic waterfront sites in the world, and the government agrees the beautiful promenade should be made much better use of. It wants to set up a statutory body with executive powers that will oversee the proper development of the promenade. Vincent Ng, a member of the existing advisory body, Harbourfront Commission, says there's a lot of work to be done, but one of the main goals is to connect the whole 73 kilometres of the harbourfront.
So people can, for example, either walk or jog from Kennedy Town to Shau Kei Wan, right? And similarly over the other side of the harbour. The challenges is that, well, the harbour has been developed over times, and not every piece of land are actually available or under government control. Some of them are part of the private ownership. So fitting it out all together is like playing jigsaw puzzle. So sometimes you find a missing link.
Speaking to TVB News today, Ng said the plan is to make the promenade more vibrant, perhaps with outdoor performances, concerts and cafes, and the proposed Harbourfront Authority will aim to cut through government bureaucracy to achieve its goals. One major concern people have is whether or not the promenade will ultimately be used to reap economic benefits of tourism. But Ng said the authority set up will be firm on its social objectives.
The harbour is for the people enjoyment, so it's not for making money. Commercialization is not crime. Sometimes people like some sort of commercial. Like, you know, buying an ice cream is commercial, right? But you are not developing that into a big shopping mall that sells cosmetic, that sells milk formula or gold shop. It's not something that we are after.
The public consultation on how the Harbourfront Authority should be set up will last until January 4th. Diane To, TVB News.
Complaints have been growing in recent weeks about houseflies in the Tuen Mun area. Residents in surrounding estates and villages have blamed the nearby landfill for the problem. Stephanie Choi reports.
Imagine being pestered by flies. Dozens of them. This villager from Hapak Nai says it takes less than half an hour for the insects to fill a sheet of fly paper. Harassed villagers suspect that the houseflies come from the neighboring landfill, and they are not alone.
Today's inspection is obviously to give a clear signal to the Environmental Department, Protection Department, that we are indeed very and gravely concerned about the situation.
One of the reasons for his concern is that an infestation of flies that happened in Tuen Mun almost 2 decades ago was the result of a poorly managed landfill. A spokesperson from the Environmental Protection Department, or EPD, insists that the landfill was not the source of these pests. The EPD says they already have measures in place to keep insects from breeding, such as the green mats you see behind me. They also say their contractor will step up pest control measures. But will they be effective? Ho believes more needs to be done.
Their action is merely responsive to the complaints. Okay? That is not good enough.
His colleague, Helena Wong, thinks that various government departments, such as the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department, need to get their hands dirty for the interest of public health. She says the EPD hasn't been completely honest about the situation at the landfill, because from what she heard, workers there were worried about flies entering their mouths. Lawmakers and the villagers are urging the government to speed up their investigations, while current measures, they say, haven't done much at all. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
Technicians have carried out the first official test of a movable flood barrier in the Italian city of Venice. Also known as the experimental electromechanical module, it was chosen to protect Venice from so-called high tide events. That happens when flooding from seawater becomes too much for the city to handle. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the number of high tide events in the Venetian area has increased due to ground lowering and rising sea levels. High tides cause flooding in the city, damaging buildings and disrupting commercial activities. The risk of a major high tide event in Venice is quite real, since it happened before in November 1966. And that's a wrap of our news. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Good night.